Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Amid trade disruptions and an uncertain global economic environment, finance ministers and central bank governors from all around the world will meet in Washington next week to discuss what is ahead for the global economy. To kick off these discussions, today we will explore how Latin America and the Caribbean can navigate these uncertain times, while also seizing emergent opportunities to unlock their economic potential for growth and development. And to help us unpack these, we are thrilled to partner with the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, and we welcome our two stellar speakers, Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, who is Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank, and Alfonso Garcia Mora, Regional Vice President for Europe and Latin America at the International Finance Corporation. So, without further ado, I pass the floor to Martine Casanelli, who is the Assistant Director at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, who will moderate this discussion. Martine?
Thank you very much, Adrienne, and thank you for your steadfast commitment to Latin America and the Caribbean. And I want to especially thank you, Alfonso, and thank you, Felipe, for joining us here at the Atlantic Council on this Friday before what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting and timely World Bank IMF Spring Meetings. And thank you especially for your partnership during that week with us at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. As Adrienne mentioned, the spring meetings are occurring in a context of increased geopolitical uncertainty and trade tensions for countries around the world. But this is, of course, always an opportunity for countries to discuss what is ahead for the global economy and how to navigate these times. So I want to start with a question to both of you, and I will start with you, Felipe. In this context, what should we expect for the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean? And what do you hope will be addressed during next week?
Good morning to Adrienne, good morning Martine, and to everybody who's listening in. Listen, I think what's happening right now is that Latin American economies are again seeing that the growth prospects are not picking up. So I expect that what we are going to get next week again is a lot of reflection on how they could improve their economies and generate jobs and incomes for the population. Last year, according to our numbers, the whole region grew at a rate of about 2.2%, and that is, well, it's above zero. It's a very low number, and it is the lowest growing region. And this is something that, unfortunately, since the pandemic, is repeating itself. Very few countries have really addressed the issue that, it's a key to generating jobs, which is to have reforms, to approve reforms that really get to the core of the weaknesses. So I assume that ministers will come to discuss these kinds of issues, and I think the core reforms that are valid in most of these countries are actually well known. They need to tackle, poor education systems. They need to tackle transparency, corruption, and the governance side of things, and also heavy business regulations. And they need to make sure that they create an environment that is friendly to investment and the generation of jobs.
And moving on that very same issue, Alfonso, as in the IFC with a strong focus on the private sector is also, some of the main players that come to Washington, D.C. during these weeks. So what do we expect for Latin American and Caribbean private sector? And perhaps, if I can rephrase the question, what would success look like for next week for the private sector and the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean?
So thank you, Martin, and thank you, Adrienne, for inviting us. As Felipe was saying, it's a pleasure to be here. So I think that we are probably since a few years back, but especially now, in a context in which the dialogue and the coordination between private and public sector is more needed than ever. No? So there are no solutions that can be, or there are no development goals that can be achieved if you don't really involve the private sector as a participant in the solution. No? And I think that type of dialogue is what we from the World Bank Group we are trying to push, to support, to strengthen, because it's critical. When you define a policy reform, when you define an regulation, you need to listen, you need to bring the private sector, because you do need this for the private sector. But at the end of the day, the final beneficiary are the citizens, but you need the private sector to create jobs, you need the private sector to provide services, you need the private sector to produce goods and services. No? So at the end of the day, this dialogue is fundamental. We are in a context of high uncertainty, it's clear, in a context where when you have high uncertainty, probably your investment decisions get postponed or delayed. And this is something that we need to try to avoid, because at the end of the day, what Felipe was mentioning, this low growth of the Latin American region is also a consequence of the lack of long-term investment that is the one that can really activate the machinery of job creation and development. No? So how to navigate in a context where uncertainty is present, that this dialogue, that this initiative from the private sector is aligned with the reforms that the public sector is doing, to me, is the main goal of these spring meetings, as we like to think and say.
And I want to stick to one point that both of you mentioned, which is job creation and the role of jobs. This year, particularly during these World Bank IMF spring meetings, the World Bank's theme for this year is, in fact, jobs, and in fact, emphasizing the role that jobs have as drivers of prosperity. So on that issue, Felipe, I would like to ask you a question. What does that mean specifically for a demographically young, we should say, region like Latin America and the Caribbean, but that it also has been and currently is fighting with different barriers to the job market, such as, for example, informality or also inequality?
Exactly, Martin. I think it's timely for Latin America and the Caribbean to focus on jobs. And I think it has really two very different aspects in this agenda. The first one is education. It is sad to recognize that when Latin America tests its kids, the majority of them that go to public education get scores that are, again, among the lowest in the world.
Latin America has still a problem of firm growth. So you have a huge number of micro enterprises, you have a significant number of small enterprises, many of them, if not most of them, are informal, and we have a huge problem for these companies to grow and to become medium-sized companies, which is actually the critical change for job creation, because these medium-sized companies are the ones who generate more good jobs that can be stable along the way. No? So how can we think on what are the policy reforms, what are the incentives that are needed to allow and to promote and to support companies to grow and to become medium-sized companies, that some of them could also become large companies? I think that that's a critical thing that the region has not solved yet. When you compare it, for instance, with other regions like Southeast Asia, no? You see a very different story, and you see that the success story of Southeast Asia, to some extent, is also the story of medium-sized companies that grew, and that therefore you had all the way and all the path for that growth. No? So thinking on competition, what are the main constraints? Is it a question of access to credit? Is it a question of regulations? Is it a question of business environment? Is it a question of predictability? Is it a question of skills? All of the above, probably that's the answer, but we need to work together to achieve all of the above. No?
And now I would like to take the question, extract it a little bit, and then ask a similar question to you, Felipe, which is focusing on governments right now. Regional governments always, must strike the right balance between structural reforms that are needed to seize economic opportunities, minimize risks, while also working to address long-standing social demands. So, one could argue that the balance is even more pressing now in this changing economic landscape with the current tensions. So my question to you, Felipe, would be, what should regional governments do right now to prioritize now to strike that balance, or to square that circle of both structural reforms, minimizing risks, while also making sure that you can address those social demands that, as we know in Latin America, are very pressing?
That's a good question. Listen, I think my personal view is there's a sweet spot in which you push for big rewards and you minimize risks, and this is focusing on what's required for jobs. Because if you could generate jobs in the short term and in the medium term, it really addresses both the short term, the growth issues, the productivity issues, and the long-standing demands. I mean, it's very difficult to think of lowering poverty and inequality without good jobs. So I think there is a sweet spot there. And there, I think we laid out the importance of education, the importance of skills, and the importance of having a business environment that is friendly to investment, that is friendly to companies, local companies, domestic companies, medium-sized companies, so that they can grow and they can thrive in Latin America. The bit that I would add that is more important today is digital and artificial intelligence and all these new things in which the region cannot afford to stay behind. It really, our studies show that today with artificial intelligence, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the current jobs could be more productive. But that requires learning how to use artificial intelligence, having the skills to use the artificial intelligence. We also have data that shows that still over 40 million Latin Americans have no access to the internet, and without access to the internet, they're going to be left behind. So pushing very hard on that agenda. So those, I think, are the concerns of today.
And I would like to throw in a variable here that I think is very unique to Latin America. Well, not just unique to Latin America, but it's certainly a factor that affects Latin America and the Caribbean. That is informality. When we think of job creation and good job creation, informality, and this is perhaps a question that I would like to ask you, Alfonso, is it a challenge to good policies that could be implemented, or is it also perhaps an opportunity that if you unlock this barrier of informality moving forward, you could actually make sure that whatever policy reform you implement actually has sort of a positive effect, a double the effect perhaps, because you're both formalizing jobs while also enhancing the skills of the people that are sort of entering the formal workforce?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, it's a super complicated question that we have been trying to deal with for decades, no? And not only in Latin America, but everywhere in the world. And the issue is, we have to really think: is it informality is a cause or a consequence of something? No, and because by definition or in theory, nobody likes to be informal. And therefore, it is probably a consequence of the lack of capacity to really formalize your business or your activity. No? I think that, to be honest, I really think that the level of informality reduces as a country grow and develop. So it is not something that, it is part of the same agenda. It is part of the consequence, the formalization, if you wish, of a company becomes with the growth of the company. Because there is a moment in which they need to formalize their statements, they need to formalize and therefore they need to formalize all the, I would say, the issues that are related to the activity of their own company. No? So I think that that's super important, because then you, as you formalize the economy, you create the positive loop. No? The positive loop is, if I have a formal company, then my access to credit is easier because I have a credit registry, and therefore I can have access to credit. I can pay taxes. Well, if I pay taxes, also the fiscal situation of the country improves. If the fiscal situation of the country improves, then they can spend more on education and more on those things that are really productive. So you start with a positive loop. But for that, you need growth. Yeah. And for that, you need to create the means and the content and the environment for growth to happen. No? And here we come back to the same problem. No? I think that the region has to really focus, and the governments and ministries, on growth-led policies. I mean, we need to grow the economy. We need to really think, with the fiscal situation that we have in the countries, that a public sector is not going to be the one leading the growth agenda. We need to see how to bring the private sector for growth, for a much more clear growth activity. No? That's the key thing. That should be the focus. No? And then things will come after growth. Of course, growth needs to be inclusive. Growth needs to reduce inequality, and that will happen. But we need to. The necessary condition is that you need to grow.
Yeah. And growth happens also across sectors. So, Felipe, my question to you would be, what sectors do you think to this day, currently in Latin America and the Caribbean, show the most promise for large-scale job creation And the next question would be, how can countries seize these opportunities or the opportunities for new digital and services sectors? You were mentioning a little bit of that before, so I would like to sort of come back to that question.
Yes, I think there's a huge array of opportunities that open if countries are friendlier to business and investment, and that will generate good jobs. The majority of the jobs today in Latin America are in the services sector. And there's some really good jobs there. Like, for example, I've been so impressed the last few times I've gone to Uruguay. I always try to meet with these young people who are doing this digital, these unicorns, they're really high value services, digital services that are competing or closely allied with Silicon Valley firms, tech firms, and this is really impressive. Of course, they're well educated, they're very well connected. But unfortunately, in this whole services area, we also have some very low productivity, barely, minimum wage kind of jobs. So I think the challenge is how to bring those up, how to upgrade the ones who are low productivity, low wage, bring them up. And for that, I think a combination of skilling. You need, short-term skillings. Actually, we have shown it's been impressive, some programs that we've done in a few countries with 3 or 4 months training. You can really provide people a nice jump up. But you need to provide these programs, probably make them free so that the people who are low income can access them, and then bring them together with private sector. They need to be skills that the private sector is looking for. And then I will also mention something that's a bit unrelated, but I have to mention it because it is in the discussion everywhere in Latin America. It's very hard to generate a lot of investment and jobs if you don't also tackle the issue of crime and violence. And I'm bringing it up because almost everywhere that I go in the region, this has really spread. It used to be just a handful of countries, but on almost every country, crime and violence has become the issue of the day, the worry of the day. No simple solutions, but it really needs to be tackled because it's going to be very hard to attract private firms, investment, and create many jobs if people continue to see this as a barrier.
Last year, the Atlantic Council, we worked on a report to especially sort of the question we asked in this report is, what can we do, or what can Latin American and Caribbean countries do to attract new investment from abroad to the region? And some of the issues we pointed out was, of course, rule of law. You have education as an important part, especially sort of how can you upskill Latin American, Caribbean people. I think that if we were to write the report again this year, we would definitely focus on crime and violence also as a factor. I did want to ask Alfonso a question on the issue of sort of upskilling. One of the things that we also talked about is what can, large-scale educational reform is probably would be the best path forward, but short-cycle programs or vocational education perhaps can lead, can actually make a big difference when it comes to sort of like short policy instruments that can actually have a large impact. We actually use World Bank evidence to back that claim, but. And in the context of this report, we were thinking about global supply chains, and global supply chains really have been at the forefront, for at least 5 years since the COVID-19 pandemic, are especially pressing now, and will be pressing now in 2025. So thinking about the IFC and the role of the private sector, how can Latin America and the Caribbean become a more attractive destination for investment, especially given current shifts in supply chains? And feel free to bring anything that we've discussed just now.
No, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, one thing that I believe should be a given, and is not, is to have a strong PPP law, public-private partnership law. So you really need all the infrastructure finance that is needed in the region, basic infrastructure, social infrastructure, you name it. Requires big amount of investments. Public sector doesn't have the capacity. Private sector will require some participation of the public sector in order to provide the financing that is needed, you need to articulate PPPs in these countries. And not all countries in Latin America have a law that actually provide the certainty to the international investor that it is safe to invest in this country and that I will have the right structure to finance it. No? So this is something that I really believe that is fundamental in order to attract this international capital to the region. No? Second thing that you mentioned, the supply chain. There is a huge opportunity, two opportunities, I would say, for the Latin America corporate sector. One is to help them linking their activities to the global supply chain, and this is something that IFC tries to do. You know, there are different ways of supply chain finance, etc., that we are trying to use it to bring them connect them to the global supply chain. But second, which is the other opportunity, which is the regional integration, and we have been talking many years about it in Latin America, no? Which is one of the regions with the lowest integration in the world. And this is an opportunity to also think what can we do in terms of logistics, in terms of barriers, etc., to provide more or to facilitate the integration within Latin America. No? That will create jobs because of the just as a consequence of that. No? And you were asking before on sectors. No? I mean, it's very difficult to pick up sectors when you think about job creation. No? But there are, if you think about what are the more labor-intensive sectors, you actually realize that Latin America has clear comparative advantages on those sectors. No? Let's say agribusiness. Well, Latin America is one of the biggest food producers in the world. No? Infrastructure, we are mentioning it. There is a huge gap of basic infrastructure that can really be articulated with the right PPP, bringing the international capital, creating jobs, etc. Healthcare. In Latin America, there is a big production of pharmaceuticals, for instance. Right. No? So there are many tourism. Well, Latin America is a clear focus of tourism. No? It's a question of, okay, and for these sectors, what is needed in order to continue investing, to increase investment, to attract capital? We need that microanalysis at the sector level to see what is needed from the public sector side to catalyze and to bring more private capital. No?
Absolutely. And I would like to ask a final question to both of you, and sort of thinking especially about the role of both of your organizations and multilateral institutions writ large. You know, as we look to the future, multilateral institutions will also have to adjust to this changing landscape. Recently, the international financial institutions extended new funding to Argentina, really demonstrating the bank's commitment to supporting reform and countries' responses to global volatility writ large. So first question or final question to you, Felipe, would be how is the World Bank adapting to these strategies to better assist the region in this changing global landscape?
Yes, Martin, I think what we're doing is pushing through with trying to be faster and more efficient in our regular loans and also with our special loans that support big reforms. I've been particularly proud that, you know, there's been 2 or 3 countries that have pushed big reforms recently, and we've been able to very quickly come together. I mean, you mentioned Argentina. Very quickly, we put together a $1.5 billion loan to support reforms on trade, on how this government has pushed through some important reforms to integrate more and make Argentina more closely, to benefit from the world trading system, and also on the fiscal front, which has always been Argentina's weakness. And we feel very strongly that they're improving that, and we supported that financially. Recently, also, we went with a $1 billion loan to support Brazil's reform of the value-added tax, which is a landmark change in Brazil. Last year also, Ecuador finally tackled its long-standing energy subsidies, gasoline, fuel subsidies that were so wasteful and untargeted. And so responding to governments that are pushing forward with key reforms, I think it's part of our role, and responding rapidly and with substantial financing.
Same question to you, Alfonso, to wrap us up.
So 2 things that we are doing differently, or we are doing more, I would say. The last 2 years, we have multiplied by 3 the investments that we have done, IFC, in the region, no? Mobilizing others. But the 2 big things that we are really supporting and promoting together, Felipe and myself, one is to really link much more the private sector investments to the public sector interventions. So to really think on the development goal. What is the development objective? And how can we bring the different instruments and the different parts of the economy to achieve that development goal? I think that's a big thing that is changing the dynamic of how the development was thought before or in the past. No? And the second one is mobilization. We need to mobilize others. It is not just about IFC investing.
Right.
It is what IFC can bring to the table. Mm-hmm. So our ambition is to minimize the investment that we do in our own balance sheet, and to the minimum that is needed, we structure the operation, we design the operation, we invest the minimum that is required, and then we bring other investors that are interested in that project or that are interested in investing in that country to invest here together with us. No? So mobilization, which means opening the market to other investors so that they get used to it and they are familiarized with it. And two, or first, thinking with a much more, I would say, strategic and holistic perspective on what is needed in each of these countries.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both. And thank you very much for joining us here on this last Friday, probably before next week starts to pick up and ministers come to DC. And well, thank you very much for taking the time to come talk to us. And thank you very much for your partnership throughout next week. For our virtual audience, please make sure to check out our IMF and World Bank Spring Meeting coverage and programming. Next week, the Atlantic Council will host over 30 and perhaps over 40, I believe, finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world. And want to encourage everyone that is tuned online to check out the programming at atlanticcouncil.org. Thank you very much, Alfonso. Thank you very much, Felipe. Have a great weekend. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.